Hello, I'm continuing my DVD collection video where I talk about my favorite horror films from the 1970s with a part 3, but if you haven't already, go check out parts 1 and 2 of this video. The first movie I want to talk about is Carrie. Now, Carrie is directed by Brian De Palma, who of course would go on to direct Scarface. Now, this wasn't Brian De Palma's first movie, but this was definitely the movie that really shot De Palma into the mainstream, and the film stars Sissy Spacek and Piper Laurie and John Travolta, and this is of course based on a book by Stephen King, which was actually Stephen King's first novel, and if you've seen my book review videos, you would know I'm a really big Stephen King fan, but Carrie is a freaking awesome movie. Basically, it's about this young girl named Carrie who is bullied at her high school, but she's also abused by her crazy mother, who is this religious nutcase, and it turns out that she actually has telekinetic powers, and she ends up using these powers to get revenge on the kids who bullied her, as well as on her crazy mother. It's a really good movie, and both Sissy Spacek and Piper Laurie were actually nominated for Academy Awards for their roles in this movie. But yeah, Carrie is a really good movie. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. The next movie I want to talk about is The Omen. Now, The Omen is directed by Richard Donner, who of course would go on to direct movies like Superman, and The Omen stars Gregory Peck and Lee Remick. Basically, The Omen is about this ambassador played by Gregory Peck, whose newborn son ends up dying, so he ends up adopting a new child, but what he doesn't realize is this child he has adopted is actually the son of the devil. And The Omen is a classic movie. I think pretty much everybody has seen The Omen, but if you haven't, definitely check it out. The next movie I want to talk about is Grizzly, and basically this is kind of like a cash-in on Jaws. Like, after Jaws came out, they made a lot of these killer animal type movies, and Grizzly is about this grizzly bear that terrorizes this state park, and it's a good movie, but there's definitely a lot of parallels to Jaws in this movie. Like, there's a character in this movie who's definitely based on Chief Brody from Jaws, but I always enjoyed Grizzly myself. It's a movie I definitely recommend. It's definitely not as good as Jaws, and like I said, it's hard to ignore the parallels between this and Jaws, but it's still a good movie. I would recommend it. The next movie I want to talk about is Demon Seed, and this is actually based on a book by Dean Koontz. Now, I never read the book that this movie is based on, but this stars Fritz Weaver, who most people would probably know from The Twilight Zone, and he would go on to be in Creepshow. But basically, it's about this scientist who created like this artificial intelligent computer system which pretty much runs his entire house, but what happens is the computer ends up turning on the guy's wife and keeping his wife trapped inside the house, and the computer literally ends up impregnating this woman, which I know sounds really weird, but it is explained kind of in the movie, but it's a very bizarre film, but I would definitely recommend Demon Seed. The next movie I want to talk about is The Hills Have Eyes, and The Hills Have Eyes is written and directed by Wes Craven, and this was Wes Craven's second movie, and The Hills Have Eyes has always been one of my favorites. Basically, it's about this family who are on a road trip and their car breaks down in the middle of this desert, and they end up getting terrorized by this tribe of cannibals who live in the desert. It's a really good movie. I definitely recommend The Hills Have Eyes. The next movie I want to talk about is Empire of the Ants. Now, I also have this movie on VHS somewhere, but Empire of the Ants was always one of my favorite movies growing up. Like, it was always one of my favorite giant bug movies, but basically it's about these tourists who are on an island, and there's this, like, chemical spill, and all these ants end up growing to this like enormous size. It's a really fun movie. I always enjoyed Empire of the Ants myself. The next movie I want to talk about is The Sentinel. Now, The Sentinel is about this young woman who's like a model, and she has like emotional problems because of something that happened with her father a few years before the events of this movie, and she even tried killing herself at one point. But what happens is she moves into this apartment building, and it turns out that the apartment building is actually the gateway to hell. It's a really good movie, even though it is definitely kind of a cash-in on movies like The Exorcist and The Omen. Like, when The Exorcist and The Omen came out, they made a lot of these, like, kind of satanic type movies, you know, movies about the devil, but I always enjoyed this one myself, and this actually has some pretty big names in it. Like, John Carradine is in this movie, Burgess Meredith, Chris Sarandon, and a very young Christopher Walken is in this movie, and this even has Jeff Goldblum in it, and I think this may have been Jeff Goldblum's first movie, I'm not sure, but The Sentinel is a really good movie. I definitely recommend it. The next movie I want to talk about is Equus, which I have on this DVD set with 3 other horror movies. Now, Equus I consider to be more of a drama film than a horror movie, but apparently a lot of people do consider it to be a horror movie, which is why I'm talking about it in this video. But, you know, Equus is a really good movie. Basically, it's about this young man who blinds all these horses with this metal spike, and he gets sent to a psychiatric hospital, but it turns out that he actually worships horses as kind of like a religious symbol, and this whole thing he did with the horses by blinding them, it turns out that it was some kind of religious thing that he did, and his doctor now fears that by quote-unquote curing him of his insanity, that the doctor fears that what if that's religious persecution, and it gets into a lot of philosophical things about what is normal, you know, what's normal to one person might not be normal to another person. It's a really good movie. It's not really a horror film. It's more of a drama film than a horror movie, but the reason I'm talking about it in this video is apparently a lot of people do consider it to be a horror film, and it's also on this DVD set of horror movies, but Equus is a film I definitely recommend. The next movie I want to talk about is Eraserhead. Now, this is directed by David Lynch, who would go on to direct movies like The Elephant Man, Dune, and Blue Velvet, and Eraserhead has always been one of my favorites. This is a very surreal movie, a very surreal, very dreamlike movie, and it is kind of an artsy kind of movie, but I really enjoy it, though. Like, you know, it's a very hard movie to describe. Like, the best way I can describe it is it appears that the movie is set in some kind of post-apocalyptic world, and it deals with this man whose wife has this monster baby, and he has to take care of this baby, but throughout the movie he goes into his own dreams, and he has these really horrific dreams with this, like, you see this woman with, like, these weird things coming out of her face who's singing this song that goes, "In heaven, everything is fine," and the band The Pixies actually did a cover of that song from this movie, but Eraserhead is a really good movie, though. It's a very weird movie, and I used to actually call this the weirdest movie I've ever seen. Then I've seen other movies that are even weirder than this, but one of those I will be talking about in this video, but Eraserhead is a really good movie. You know, and I actually have let friends borrow this movie, and they returned it to me going, what the fuck did I just watch? But I enjoy Eraserhead, and I definitely recommend it. The next movie I want to talk about is Suspiria. Now, Suspiria is an Italian horror film directed by Dario Argento, and this is a really good movie. Basically, it's about this ballet student who goes to this ballet school in, I think, Germany, I believe, and it turns out that the school is run by witches. It's a really good movie, and actually a pretty creepy movie, too. And this movie also has beautiful music in it from Goblin, and I actually have the soundtrack for this movie right here, actually. I got this at a horror convention a couple of years ago, but yeah, Suspiria, it's a really good movie. It's considered to be one of Dario Argento's best movies, and I know there were 2 sequels to this. I know there was a film called Inferno, which was a sequel to this, and I think the third one was called Mother of Tears or something, but I haven't seen the 2 sequels, but Suspiria is definitely a film I recommend. Now, remember I said that I used to think Eraserhead was the weirdest movie ever made? That was before I saw this movie, House. Now, House is a Japanese horror film which came out in 1977, and dear God, this is one of the weirdest fucking movies I've ever seen in my life. Like, if you thought Eraserhead was weird, wait till you see this movie. I mean, this is seriously one of the most bizarre films ever made. Like, the best way I can describe this movie is it's literally like a live-action cartoon, and there are actually some sequences of animation in this movie, but it's just such a weird movie. Basically, it's about this group of girls who go out to this house out in the country, which is owned by one of the girls' aunt, and, it turns out that the house is haunted, but even before they get to the haunted house, weird shit is happening just because of how weird the characters act. You know, it's such a weird freaking movie. Like, and I've seen this movie a couple of times, but I was recently rewatching it last night for this video, and even rewatching it last night, even though I've already seen it a couple of times, I was still in awe at just how weird it is. I was watching it going like, this is fucking weird, but I mean, it's just such a bizarre movie, and I don't smoke weed or anything, not that I have anything against it, it's just, it was never really my thing, but dear God, I can imagine what a stoner would be like watching this movie. It's seriously one of the most bizarre films ever made, but probably one of the most unique films ever made as well. I would definitely recommend House, but only if you would be into something as weird as this movie. And just watch the trailer for this movie. Type in on YouTube, House 1977 trailer, and the trailer alone will just tell you how weird this movie is. But yeah, that's House. The next movie I want to talk about is Blue Sunshine. Now, Blue Sunshine is about these people who back in the 60s did this weird LSD type stuff called Blue Sunshine, and what happens is now their hair starts falling out and they start going crazy and start killing people, and the movie follows this guy who's accused of the murders that one of the people who were the victims of Blue Sunshine committed, so now he's trying to figure out who created Blue Sunshine and how he could possibly stop all this from happening. But it's a really good movie. I definitely recommend Blue Sunshine, and this is actually directed by the same guy who directed another movie called Squirm. But yeah, if you haven't seen Blue Sunshine, definitely check it out. The next movie I want to talk about is Halloween, which I actually don't have on DVD, I have it on VHS, but Halloween is a classic movie, and it really needs no introduction. Like, everybody knows what Halloween is, and I doubt very seriously that there's a person watching this video who hasn't seen Halloween yet. Halloween is a great movie. Now, even though I do definitely think this is one of the best horror movies ever made, this isn't one of my all-time favorite John Carpenter movies, though, because the film is co-written and directed by John Carpenter. But to be honest with you, I like his later movies like The Thing, The Fog, Escape from New York, and They Live a little bit better. Like, this is definitely a great horror movie, but I don't think it's like the best example of John Carpenter's work, at least not in my opinion. But Halloween, it's definitely a classic movie, and the film is considered to be the first slasher film. However, I personally don't consider it to be the first slasher film because the Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out before this, and that could be considered a slasher film. Even Psycho could be considered a slasher film, and some of Herschel Gordon Lewis's movies could be labeled as slasher films, so I don't really consider this to be the first slasher film, but it's definitely the first slasher movie to really make the genre a mainstream thing. But Halloween, it's definitely a good movie. If you haven't seen it, which I doubt there's anybody who didn't see it yet, but if you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. The next movie I want to talk about is Magic. Now, this stars a very young Anthony Hopkins. It also has Burgess Meredith in it and Anne Margaret. Now, Magic is about this ventriloquist who has this dummy named Fats, and it turns out that he's like schizophrenic or has like split personality disorder, and he actually thinks that his dummy Fats is alive, and Fats starts telling him to kill people. It's a really, really good movie, and this is actually written by William Goldman, who would actually go on to write movies like The Princess Bride, and he also wrote the screenplay for the movie Misery, which of course was based on a Stephen King novel, but this is also based on a book by him as well. But Magic is a really good movie, and don't think of this as like your typical possessed doll kind of movie, because it really isn't. It's actually a very, very psychological movie. But yeah, if you haven't seen Magic, definitely check it out. The next movie I want to talk about is Piranha. Now, Piranha is directed by Joe Dante, who would go on to direct Gremlins, and this is also written by John Sayles, who would also go on to be a pretty big director, and the film is also produced by Roger Corman. Now, Piranha is kind of a horror comedy, and it was made as kind of a spoof on Jaws. Well, it's definitely a very Jaws kind of movie, Jaws-esque kind of film. And the film stars Dick Miller and Barbara Steele, and Piranha is a great movie. If you haven't seen Piranha, definitely check it out. And this had a sequel made to it in the 80s, which was actually directed by James Cameron, and in the 90s there was a remake to this movie, and then a few short years ago there was another remake to this movie called Piranha 3D, and that had a sequel to it. But the original Piranha is definitely a classic. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. The next movie I want to talk about is Dawn of the Dead. Now, Dawn of the Dead is written and directed by George A. Romero, and this is a sequel to George A. Romero's 1968 horror classic, Night of the Living Dead. Now, even though this is a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, you could easily watch this movie without having to watch Night of the Living Dead. It's one of those sequels which definitely works as a standalone movie, and in my opinion, this is one of those sequels that really does surpass the original in a lot of ways. And the original Night of the Living Dead is definitely a classic movie, but I actually think Dawn of the Dead is an even better movie than Night of the Living Dead, because there's so much to this movie. Because, aside from just being a horror film, this movie is also a black comedy. It's also also kind of a drama film, and it's also a political satire about consumerism. Dawn of the Dead, it's a great movie. If you haven't seen Dawn of the Dead, definitely check it out. And this movie also has music in it composed by Goblin and Dario Argento. But Dawn of the Dead, if you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. The next movie I want to talk about is Lucio Fulci's Zombie, and Zombie also goes by the title Zombie 2 in Italy. This is an Italian horror film, and in Italy this movie is called Zombie 2 because in Italy Dawn of the Dead was actually called Zombie, so when they released this movie they called it Zombie 2 in Italy, but here in the States it was called Zombie. The movie also goes by the title Zombie the Flesh Eaters, but Zombie is a great movie. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. The next movie I want to talk about is Phantasm. Now, Phantasm is written and directed by Don Coscarelli, and this is a freaking amazing movie. Now, Phantasm is about this 13-year-old boy who, while he's by this funeral home, he notices that there's some really weird shit going on at the funeral home, and it turns out that the mortician at the funeral home is actually an alien from what is either another planet or another dimension, and he's actually taken all the dead bodies and turning them into zombie dwarfs and shipping them off to his world to be slaves in his world. And it's such a classic movie, and it's a very surreal movie. Like, it's a very dreamlike movie because there are certain points in this movie where you're not sure if it's real or if it's just a dream, but it's a very surreal film, and honestly it's very similar to, like, Italian horror films, even though this is actually an American horror film. Like, this is like if an American made an Italian horror film, because even though it's an American horror film, it does definitely kind of have the feel of a lot of Italian horror films, and the music in this movie is absolutely phenomenal. Some of the best music in a horror film, in my opinion. And the villain of the movie, the tall man, which is the mortician in the movie, he's like one of the best horror movie villains out there, in my opinion. Like, he's right up there with Michael Myers, Jason, and Freddy Krueger, and and this movie also had a couple of sequels made to it, and there's a 5th movie coming out pretty soon, and I can't wait for Phantasm 5 to come out. But if you haven't seen Phantasm, definitely check this out. And I also have a t-shirt for this movie, which I'm not wearing now, but if you saw some of my other videos, you may have seen me wearing the Phantasm t-shirt. But yeah, if you haven't seen Phantasm, definitely see it. The next movie I want to talk about is Alien from 1979. Now, Alien is directed by Ridley Scott, and it stars Sigourney Weaver, Tom Skerritt, and John Hurt. And I have Alien on the Alien Quadrilogy box set. Now, the first Alien movie, of course, is a classic movie, and it's a horror science fiction movie about these people on a spaceship who are being killed off one by one by an alien monster, and, it's a great movie, but the original Alien is actually a much more psychological movie than I think people really remember it for, because not just is it about an alien killing these people, but it's the whole idea that they're alone on this spaceship in the middle of space and they can't go anywhere. So it's a much more psychological movie and a much more disturbing movie than people really give the movie credit for. It really is a great movie, and the monster in the movie, the Xenomorph, is definitely one of the greatest movie monsters in cinema history. The next movie I want to talk about is a David Cronenberg movie called The Brood, and this is another really good one. Basically, it's about this mentally disturbed woman who actually has powers, and she creates these children who are actually these creatures that are kind of like a manifestation of her anger, and a lot of that is directed at her husband, but it's a really good movie. I definitely recommend The Brood. The next movie I want to talk about is Salem's Lot. Now, this DVD of Salem's Lot I got from an old Blockbuster that was closing down a couple of years ago, so I ended up buying the movie. That's why you see the little Blockbuster sticker there. But Salem's Lot is a made-for-TV movie directed by Tobe Hooper, who also directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and this is based on a book by Stephen King. Now, Salem's Lot is about an author who comes to this small town in Maine called Jerusalem's Lot, or Salem's Lot as the locals call it, and he comes there to write a book about this haunted house in the town called the Marston House, but it turns out that the Marston House has been sold to this antique shop owner, and it turns out that the antique shop owner is actually the human servant of a vampire named Kurt Barlow, and it's a really good movie. It's definitely one of my favorite movies, and I already did a review for this movie a couple of years ago, so you can go check out that review if you want, but it is a really good movie. It's a little different from the book, but it's still a good movie. The next movie I want to talk about is When a Stranger Calls. Now, this movie is based on that whole urban legend about the babysitter and the stranger upstairs or something, but When a Stranger Calls begins where this babysitter starts receiving these phone calls from a guy saying, "Have you checked the children?" And what happens is it turns out that the phone calls were coming from inside the house, and this guy actually murders the children, and that's really only the beginning of the movie. And that scene in the beginning, which is like the first 20 minutes of the movie, that's the scene that everybody remembers about this movie, but honestly there's a lot more to this movie than just that, because after that the guy ends up getting arrested and sent to a psychiatric hospital, but a few years later he ends up escaping from the psychiatric hospital, and it's actually a much more psychological movie than people give it credit for, because in the film you see this psychopath really become kind of like the lead character in the movie, because throughout most of the film you see him really kind of trying to put his life back together again, but of course he ends up failing miserably at that, and you have a detective who's after him who really just wants to kill him. But When a Stranger Calls is a really, really good movie, and there was a sequel made to this in the 90s called When a Stranger Calls Back, and there was a remake made to this in 2006. I never saw the remake, but I'm told to avoid the remake at all costs, but the original When a Stranger Calls is definitely a movie to check out. The next movie I want to talk about is a movie I have on the Chilling Classics box set, and it's a movie that came out in 1979, and that movie is The Driller Killer. Now, The Driller Killer is directed by Abel Ferrara, who would go on to direct movies like The King of New York and Bad Lieutenant. Basically, The Driller Killer is about this artist who is in the same apartment building as this like punk group, and and they're practicing like every night, and it's starting to drive him crazy, and basically he ends up going crazy and he starts killing people with a drill, and it's a really good movie, and it is kind of like an art house kind of movie, but it's a film I always enjoyed, and some people have said that it's basically if Taxi Driver was a slasher film, that's how this movie would kind of be. That's what I heard a couple of people refer to this movie as, and honestly I kind of agree with that, but The Driller Killer is a movie I definitely recommend. The next movie I want to talk about is Prophecy. Now, Prophecy is actually written by David Seltzer. I hope I'm saying his last name right. And he also wrote The Omen. Now, Prophecy is about this company which is pouring all these chemicals out into this lake, and it's like right in the middle of this huge woods, and it turns out that it's doing a lot of damage to the wildlife there, and what happens is, in the movie, you end up getting this giant mutant grizzly bear, and that's the basic plot line of Prophecy, but Prophecy is a pretty good movie. I would definitely recommend it. This next movie I want to talk about, I will admit I'm kind of cheating with this one, because the next movie I want to talk about is a movie that didn't get a major release until 1980. However, this film was released in France in 1979, so technically it is a 1979 movie. However, it's really considered to be a 1980 movie because it didn't get a major release until 1980. So I will admit I'm kind of cheating with this one by even putting this movie in this video, but the next movie I want to talk about is Don't Go in the House. Now, Don't Go in the House is about a man who was tortured by his mother when he was a child, and now as an adult he starts bringing women to his house and killing them, and it's a really good movie, and it actually reminded me a lot of the movie Maniac, and this actually came out before Maniac, but Don't Go in the House is a really good movie, and I don't know if this is available on an official DVD yet, because this DVD I have is a bootleg which was actually ripped from a VHS, and I got this at a horror convention a few months ago, so I don't know if this movie is available on official DVD yet. If it is, correct me if I'm wrong, but Don't Go in the House, if you could find a copy of this movie, it's definitely worth a look. And that's it. That's my 3-part DVD collection video of my favorite horror films from the 1970s. If you haven't seen any of these movies I've talked about in these 3 videos, definitely check them out, and bye.